Good morning, Build Stuff. Hello. How many of you here have already built mobile apps? Okay, several of you. Okay, so this is all not new. You can go watch another talk. But how many of you, though, just play around with it, though, and don't actually ship? Okay, how many of you have been paid for a mobile app that you built? Yeah. How many of you have made a mobile app for the general public, not for business? Yeah, that is a different level of difficult. So, this particular talk, which I will try to condense 65 slides into 45 minutes, uh, is pretty much what my journey was as a .NET developer anyway, going from mostly building APIs and then moving into device level architecture is different. And this is the things that you think about now that you need to do. I worked for a company for several years that all I did was mobile architecture and mobile app development that went to the general masses and some as well internal apps. So these are going to be the perspectives that we all had to go through every time we were building and releasing something. And so the most common question I had over the years was, how do you get started? Because it seems like you're drinking a lot of information from the fire hose. That is true. So this is like the closest thing you're going to get to kind of a guide as to how to think about it. If you've never had to think about it, this is how you approach making decisions about stacks and making decisions about what does your work schedule even look like? What is there to do instead of just stumbling? There are, of course, many of these aspects of my career have become solved problems if you just buy this particular framework or that, but it still make sure that it puts all the questions in the same bucket. These are the questions you have to answer. So that's what I'm going to ask in each of these slides. So these are the things you need to consider when you're trying to conquer what it means to really ship all the way a mobile app successfully being the key word here. If you're interested in the slide deck, at least in one of the versions of them, this is the URL for that. I figured I'd give it to you now, so that way, just in case you wanted it for later. And I just updated this slide deck, so I'll give you the nice new shiny one uploaded this evening. If you're interested in an actual introduction, I suppose I should show you a slide. Who says who I am? My name is Heather Downing, and I've done a lot of .NET and mobile work for over a decade. Recently, though, I've gotten into the startup path, and I'm building a fintech gaming app that I'm going to release, and it's in its early stages. So I get to go through all of this all over again, and so it's very fresh in my mind. I've worked mostly on big enterprise applications at scale, and so I never really got a chance to do the smaller thing. So it's kind of a cool phase of my life to do for that. How I got started my internship was that I first worked on a mobile app that was my very first internship where I had to handwrite XML for every single state in the United States based on who they were, and all the decisions would trigger UI based on which state they would choose and all their answers. So this has been a long, hard, painful path to getting to where I am today. And it was way back before we had anything additional in our toolkit. We were manually making these updates. All right. This is the overview of kind of how this is going to go. I like themes, and so this is a David and Goliath theme. There are going to be some pictures, and that is your only comic relief because I'm not very funny. So this is more of a kind of map of what to do. I'm not going to give you a strongly opinionated view on anything because I believe that there exists a right tool for certain jobs, and I have tried that approach and it does not work. So it's important that you reevaluate your tool set every time you build something like this. All right, I'm going to show you how to go through about figuring out what you actually want, and saying I want to build a mobile app is not enough. Picking your tech stack is important to not just be the incumbent tech stack that you just know. Figuring out how you will approach the code base that you're going to be building. Not forgetting about how to defend your castle. Thinking about how to identify bugs. And of course, publishing is everybody's favorite topic in mobile. And then I also have a little bit of a decision tree that has gone through permutations over the years that kind of asks you a question and kind of leads you down a path that is most likely going to be the one that you want, which you could always skip to, I suppose, in the slide deck and then go see another talk. And then I'll give you some parting advice. Does this sound good? Cool. So let's start by asking a critical question. So what is your desired result and what end product are you aiming for? You want to create the best mobile app ever and dominate the competition. Of course you do. That's what everybody says, or at least that's what your product owner says, right? We all want something that makes us proud, but in the real world, things never go as planned. So how many of you have been coding in mobile development for less than 5 years? Ah, okay, a couple of you. Yeah. How about more than 10? Right, you guys are in the middle. That kind of middle ground where you're dangerous, so you kind of know enough to really get things going, but you don't have all the wisdom yet as to the new approaches you get to have. It takes a while. I've been doing this for a long time. Okay, so the next question is this a game? How are you going to slay this? Is this a forms-based application? Maybe even a voting app or something? Is it going to be government regulated? The more specific you can be about the end product, the better equipped you're going to be to make the right decisions throughout the development process. So I'd like you to, for this talk, think about an app you'd like to build and settle on it, okay? Think about what it is you want to do. And then look at all of the slides I'm going to show you with that end goal in mind, okay? And the reverse engineering of it. Take a good look at the options that are around you. Consider your target audience. I mean, your data needs, your overall goals, all these things we are supposed to do all the time. It's quite a lot. So let's just settle on what is the end result, and we'll work our way back. Do you have in your mind what you'd like? Then let's move on. Just have to do a few things here. I mean, obviously, we're going to start with primary target audience. What are their needs and preferences? If you're building something for, let's say, a lot of people in retirement, you're going to go about things a little bit differently because they may have a lot of data that you have to manage in like an app that's government-based. They also may not be very good at login. They may not understand the technology that you have, which means you have to make different decisions. And not all of this is going to be in your control. I understand that. Sometimes we're on a team and someone else has made those decisions. But you should always think through them and challenge the decisions that have been made. Specify your core functionality. So what key features do you absolutely have to have for it to be valuable at all? If you could just do one thing in the very beginning, what could that one thing be? I'm not going to count login for you, so don't worry. What is the one piece of functionality you could write that actually would make it worth opening up? Okay, you must start there because that'll be the one, your first function will be the one that has the most amount of time with you, the most time to mature. And so if you think about the most important one, it's best to start with it. And ensuring platform compatibility is always fun. So sometimes it's not important that you target every system because maybe your demographic only ever uses iPhones and buys a new one every 6 months. That's a very specific demographic, right? But if you are doing something that like Google Maps, if you were to create the app Google Maps, you know that you have to be supported on Android and iOS devices all around the world, and especially in nations where you don't have a lot of bandwidth and you have very slow available power on the actual device because there are very inexpensive phones that will also be running it. This is one of my favorite parts, ironically, of mobile development is that you have to think about all the different kinds of demographics and what that might look like. By clearly defining your desired result from the outset, you're setting yourself up for a much smoother process. So, you got your desired demographic in your head. You know what platforms you're going to target. Great. So, are you going to be consumer deployed or business to business? You know you can do that. Some of you probably know that you could do that. You can just do an internal app for a company. Like let's say Build Stuff was a company and we just wanted to have an agenda app, right? We don't need to put that on the App Store or the Play Store. That can just be something that we download or we distribute another way. And that's the first decision you got to make. Next one is whether or not it's going to be self-contained or a service-driven app. The amount of times that service-driven apps are built versus self-contained is 90 to 10 at this point. Most of them are service-driven, which is why there is not as good battery life anymore, because all your apps, even in their dormant state, are very chatty. They want to grab information and sync it back to a server. Can you think of one app you use that is self-contained that doesn't reach out to the internet? Yeah, calculator. That's a good one. Yeah, that's good. What? Wordle, there you go. There's one. What about a flashlight that actually works with the physical hardware? Accelerometer, or like when I go hiking, my phone will tell me exactly how high up I am. It can tell my altitude, my altimeter, right? Maybe my Fitbit can work completely offline, or your Apple Watch can work completely offline because it just monitors the actual device as you move. It's really fascinating that we are hyper-connected, but we don't necessarily need to be hyper-connected all the time. You have to decide on local storage or if you're going to data sync to server. Now, because data is what everybody wants, at some point you probably want to shove it up to the cloud, right? But not always. Sometimes it's just noise, and it's not important. I'll give you an example. The app that I'm building has a lot of financial data. Is it important that I get up to the minute, up to the second information all the time, and I sync it back and forth? It depends. But for this app that we're doing, it's going to be a game that's going to give rewards to you based on what you've done that day. So it's actually rearward facing by one day. So I only need to sync once a day. I don't need to do it all the time. And I can also do things just locally on the device. Like as decisions are being made by the user, like, hey, I'm going to go to this place and that place, and it will save the chapters of where they are in the game. I don't need to keep syncing that to the server unless they just end that gameplay. It can be local. I don't have to keep every second pushing it. You see? And the only reason that matters is because some people in my target demographic have phone plans, have internet plans that are very limited. So that means I would be eating up a lot of their data if I just constantly was pushing. So it actually doesn't work for my target demographic, whereas it may not matter for another one. So let's talk about the first approach. This is a popular one. If you consider the market share, a lot of people would think that iPhone is the first one that should be supported because it's popularized by the media. And media loves Apple products. So I'm not saying they're not great. I'm just saying that they say that everybody has an iPhone, but that's just not very true. This is pretty up-to-date data as of this year. And most people have an Android phone due to globalization. However, if you look just how steady it's been actually since about 2017, it looks like Android has kind of just stayed there at the top for a while, and it hasn't really changed much. But in the US, specifically, it is true. It's leading. And it's different if you look in the US over the years. So again, your target demographic is very different, right? If you're only ever going to hit people in Lithuania, and people in Lithuania, you need to look at what your actual demographic is using. This is probably one of my favorite slides. Does any of it surprise you? All right. Look at Spain. Crazy, right? Like almost nobody has an iPhone there. And again, this is updated information as of this year. Crazy, right? But you might have to consider who's going to pay for your in-app purchases, right? So your purchasing market might change. And it has gone different over the years. So the App Store for iPhone users is forecasted to reach 124 billion annually in 2024. But app spending on Google Play is 51 billion. So that's significantly lower. Even though there are more users, that is lower. Why is that? because a lot of the people self-select to that will can afford an iPhone will also pay a lot for some of those apps, which is why sometimes you might make the decision to only release, at least for a year, on iPhone and have your app pay for itself and then release it to the rest of the market, even though it's counterintuitive because you want to reach a lot of people, right? All right. Since we have a little bit of time, here's a picture of that, and I'm going to the next slide. All right, so let's pick which stack you want and for what your app is. Remember, you've got your app in your mind, right? If you're having a global app, remember you decided that we're going to go for the global initially out of the gate. We're not going to just start in Lithuania. We're going to go global right away. So which one do you launch first, iOS or Android? Do you launch them at the same time? How much time do you put into bugs for each? What is the ratio? So now you have to look at what is the realistic market here? What is your winning shot at taking out like for your most return of investment of your time, right? Especially when you're starting. Let's talk about the native approach for a stack. If you're going iOS, you're looking at Swift development, obviously using Xcode, and a heads up, you'll need a Mac for this. It's non-negotiable. For Android, you're dealing with Java or Kotlin in Android Studio, although everybody uses Kotlin now. Now you could use Eclipse or another JVM environment, but honestly, Android Studio was made for this, so it's helpful to use it. It just makes life easier, so do yourself a favor and try it. The nice thing about Android development is you can do it on a Windows or a Mac, so it's your choice. And at my previous company, we had a very big team doing native development. There were 9 of us, and some people were iOS specific, Android specific. I would always do the lightweight API for all the mobile devs to consume whatever we were trying to do and talk to the server, and then I would also do like third-party hybrid apps. But all of us had to learn each other's stack because sometimes it's just necessary to have all hands on deck figuring out a problem. Yes, it definitely duplicates some work, but there are some pros. You get a natural development cycle. Everything is supported, and you get specific integrations immediately, right? It's easy to find. Google and Apple provide detailed tutorials, straightforward, which is really nice. And you get full access to the libraries and hardware features, and it's pretty good performance to develop with it. So let's say one manufacturer comes out with a new kind of facial recognition, and you want to be able to use it. Really native is a great approach. If you're trying to do something very cutting edge, it will immediately have that available to you. Another pro is just the consistent user interface that you're going to see. People understand it, know it, and a lot of your defaults are very friendly. Of course, there's lots of offline capabilities, and security and compliance have already been dealt with by Apple and Google, and so you kind of know a little bit more about how that's set up. Another pro is just the natural publishing cycle. It's very native. It's the way it's supposed to be. And you generally have a better way to handle version changes. I say better loosely because you're still dealing with manufacturer upgrades, but at least it's all in one ecosystem. Now, let's not sugarcoat it. There are some significant cons to the native approach. The learning curve is pretty steep, and if you're a solo developer or a weekend warrior, you're looking at multiple environments, multiple test environments, languages, operating systems, and each with their own quirks, and that's potentially 6 different things to master just to get an app out there, right? While you could choose to develop for just one platform, most developers agree you now need to support both platforms. It doesn't make a lot of sense. However, there have been some successes with things just living on one ecosystem or another, but in general, most people agree you should support both. It can also be really costly to do this. 9 developers to do the native approach. It doesn't have to always be that way. It may just be 2. But that's 2 people doing the same code base in different languages, because you want to manage both of them. But the one that gets me is the code duplication. Like, it's difficult because my interpretation of what you've put on my Jira board is this, and the other developer will do it that way. Or let's say you are the one developer that gets to do both of them, which means it's going to take you twice as long to be in the headspace in this ecosystem versus the other. And you can do it bit by bit, or you can just build one from scratch all the way through and then have to go back and build the other one all the way through. How are you going to manage your workload? No matter which way you slice it, it is slower to do this. It is slower. You're essentially maintaining two databases, two different code bases that may or may not match. So that's something to keep in mind. But there are some clear advantages. If you want down to the metal access and you're building a game with high intensity graphics, like that's probably a good way to go. That brings us to the cross-platform compiled approach. So that's the write once, run everywhere idea. And it's supposed to be the compelling balance between code reuse and native integration and performance, making a very popular choice for a lot of mobile app projects. It's supposed to reduce development time and costs because you have one code base written in a language that's then compiled down natively to either Kotlin or Swift. Okay? Then it's supposed to also be seamless in its native integration. You're supposed to be able to also leverage its APIs to write your own against it if you need to. And there's supposed to be some good performance optimization. It really depends on which one you choose, but that's supposed to be the reason you might choose this approach. Native mobile app frameworks are still the dominant choice in the market, but hybrid and cross-platform are really starting to become more popular for lots of reasons. Obviously, some of the reasons you would choose this because you could do it on either a Windows or a Mac, but if you want to actually build your iOS files, it needs to be done on a Mac. It doesn't have to be your machine, but it has to be done on a Mac somewhere. You're always going to need some sort of custom IDE or plugin environment for this in order to actually run and be able to see an emulator of what you've got going on. And of course, it's nice that you can share the same code base all the way here. This approach is really powerful because it facilitates kind of sharing your data and business logic. You can separate your UI layers too, which you absolutely should also do. And I know this isn't a design class, but trust me on this one, always separate your UI. I have seen many different apps that have come into different app stores and then been rejected from them because it was an iOS app that looks like an Android menu and vice versa. All right, we already kind of went a little bit through those pros. But of course, it can actually cost a bit. A lot of the good ones actually cost you money. So that's one reason. It requires a lot more work than just writing it once. Almost always you have to massage and chase the rabbits, but less rabbits than if you were to completely duplicate the code base. It does add a layer of complexity to your setup and publish because you're going to read documentation on how to do things natively and then in your mind have to port that over. If you have a really good platform that you've chosen, it should help you with that if they did really good research and good documentation, but it's not always the case. And of course, sometimes the recipes for how you would approach a scenario, like how do we make a hamburger menu? How do we do swipe to text? How do we do this or that? Is going to be random Reddit threads and all over the place. There's going to be one way that you can do certain things that the platform will tell you about. Then there's all the real ways that developers do things. And unfortunately, they're not in one coherent place. So you have to be very creative with how to find that. All right. Here's an example of one of those platforms, which is Kotlin multi-platform. Obviously, the idea behind this is that they would actually have it run on not just Android or iOS, but also desktop and web. And going from one platform proliferate down. But again, each one of them is going to have their own unique ways of interacting with the user and with the server and dealing with storage space on their device. While it might not be any sort of a big deal on the web, it will definitely be a big deal on somebody's very inexpensive Android phone that has a lot of photos of cats on it and doesn't have a lot of room for how much stuff you want to save on it. Of course, I mentioned already Kotlin multi-platform, but the most popular ones to use are like React Native, Flutter, Maui, which used to be Xamarin. Ruby Motion actually is still pretty good. I think this order is not their popularity necessarily, and there's more. There's one in PHP, there's one in C++, there are several in Python, so you can decide if you want to go that route. But these are actually pretty good because these particular platforms work very closely with the phone manufacturers to know what's coming out next so that they can prep any sort of additional modules that they need to have inside of their platform. Usually with something like Maui, it comes out 2 days after something's announced, and they usually have a library available ready to go, so that's pretty cool, which is why you might pay for it. But let's say you're not really willing to commit to that much of a setup time, and you want to do a really quick version of an application, something that's time sensitive. So if you're doing an application for Christmas this year, you really want it out there pretty quickly because we're already in November and you need to get it out so it has exposure in the month of December, but you don't really need it after that. Let's say you just need it for a window. Maybe an event or something special. So hybrid WebView might be a good option for you. Just to define what it is, for those of you who don't know, it can be any kind of app except the Windows Phone that wraps HTML and CSS in a native shell. Okay, and that's all it does. It's just a container that you can put on your phone just like any other app you might have. So while it's installed like a native app, the views are built with the web technologies we all know and love. So what's cool about this approach is its flexibility. You can code locally or use a third-party service to build and deploy it. That's cool. You don't even need a Mac to build for iOS anymore. There are services that will render the .api file for you, so it's pretty nifty. Now, you might need a custom IDE or plugin environment, but not always. Sometimes you can just use Bash to do this. It really depends on your setup and the framework that you would choose. Of course, I can build something in hybrid WebView in days. It's very quick turnaround time. Popular frameworks that are out there often will do remote builds of your code for each platform. So one for iOS, one for Android. And they'll let you use your favorite CSS and your favorite kinds of themes will work with this. And specifically, the Ionic community has very good support for each other. Yes, there we go. But many times it's not all sunshines and rainbows though, so we have to talk about the downsides because everybody wants fast. So the amount of times we built hybrid WebView when I worked at VML was only once in a while because we would do marketing campaigns. That was always very popular. So like we have the Super Bowl, you might have the World Cup, etc. Just for a little while. That would work, mostly because they didn't want to put a lot of time, money, or resources into it. Somebody just build something really quick, and more of a throwaway approach. But those remote build services can be very expensive. If you are going to do it well, to test it out how it's going to run on a whole bunch of different things. And sometimes your API options to the device is limited. Of course, friends of mine who have done this for a long time would say, oh, it's gotten really good. I can still, just like your browser on your computer, I can access your webcam, I can access this. You can access some basic stuff through WebView, yes, but you're never going to get GPU performance out of it. It's just not going to happen because you're going through an engine, a JavaScript engine, in order to present everything, right? And it's the highest probability to be rejected from the App Store. They do not like these because you can tell when it's a hybrid WebView app because it always takes a second when you're swiping through things. It's like has that little glitchiness to it. Only if you have like a lower end phone or you have a lot of just a lot on your phone already, a lot of that you have stored and cached. It seems like it doesn't perform nearly as well with touch. It's gotten better, but you can tell a real difference when you first play with it. So while hybrid apps can be quick to develop, you have to weigh those pros and cons and decide your target audience's expectations, which you've got in your brain, right? Some of the platforms are Apache Cordova, of course, Ionic, Accelerator Titanium, and Intel XDK. Here is the current market share that we're looking at for some of the different platforms that are out there. It's amazing how much React Native is leading. That one, of course, is just writing JavaScript and then having it compiled down to the native. So you're actually getting more native performance out of that. But look at how much Flutter is taking over from Maui. It's crazy how much they've grown. They are now one of the preferred cross-platform compiled options. I have so much information on the next two slides, which I can go over a little bit later. But this is kind of how I would approach. Like, is code reusability really important to me? Do I care who it was developed by? That only really matters if you're wondering if they'll shut down the operation. If it's a small company that maybe doesn't have any funding, eventually maybe you may not want to trust your entire project to it if it's a multi-year project, right? So you have to make those decisions. How would you be able to get to handle different kinds of security needs? It's all different depending on which of these you choose. So overall, I find React Native is really good for social media and real-time apps. It's really good for building your own blue sky. Right? They'd be pretty good for that. Flutter is really good at doing visually rich apps and very quick MVPs. Maui, though, has a stranglehold on really good enterprise apps because they've got the Microsoft ecosystem, and enterprise companies want to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody and make them fix something. So they like that Microsoft is putting their name on that, and they can do that. Of course, for NativeScript, it's good for any deep platform integration needs you might have. So if you want to do just a little bit more on your project than what you'd normally do, that's also a good approach. All right, so let's talk about mobile web. And what I mean is responsive websites, so basically PWAs. I've been looking around Vilnius, and I've noticed many of your websites are not responsive. It actually has gotten so bad that the browsers are taking over, and they're saying, do you want me to make this mobile? Because it looks like you need me to make this mobile for you. Of course, it's just taking matters into its own hands, slices and dices the content. It's never very good. When it tries to make the font bigger and kind of move it around, but it's not really meant for it. It's very opinionated about content placement and scaling, and that's something that is always a challenge. The good news about this, of course, is that all browsers can access this without installation. You're working with one code base, which is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which can easily integrate with your backend APIs. And yes, you can even send push notifications through the web, although it's a bit limited in what you can do on which operating systems. And unless they always have the website pulled up, they're not going to get all of the notifications all the time. So the pros, of course, are those things, is that you can also emulate a lot of the look and feel with the design, and it can very easily integrate with your server-side data. It doesn't require a download, and this is huge. Every time you ask a user to take, every step that you ask a user to take before you give them value decreases their trust in you. They're like, how many steps do I have to do? I just want to buy movie tickets. Why am I now 7 steps in to downloading an app? Because that's the only way you're allowed to do this. And you have to take my passport information and how many steps are we doing in order to get this there? If you make them jump through hoops just to use your app, they may not even like you before they've used it. So they're already mad before you go into it. So the pros are it doesn't require a download, and that's one less step. Of course, you're at the mercy of internet. So there is that. And it's very limited JavaScript library options for accessing mobile device viewing. So if you wanted to use the camera that's on the device, there are some prompts that you can do just through your website to get that to work, but it very seldom can puts limits on it as to how big the picture can be. You don't know the resolution that's going to come through that camera. There's a lot of things you have to suddenly think about you never did before if you are a web developer. And it certainly doesn't have the SEO help. So what I mean by that is that for the app that I'm building, how are my users going to discover it? When it comes to mobile games, which is what this is, most people look in the app stores and look for ratings and stars and reviews. That's what they do. And it's not going to be listed if it's a website. Even if it works on mobile, it's just not going to have that visibility because it's not in the Play Store or the App Store. So this might be a reason you choose not to do this. But I would say most of the time, The companies that are small businesses, maybe restaurants and stuff around, they don't need a mobile app. They probably need a progressive web app. They just need a good mobile website that works well for them. So all of you have gotten in your head which approach you're going to do, right? Yes? Okay. I guess I should let you look at the picture. All right. We're going to conquer it. So let's tackle the question that sparked more meetings in my mobile development career than any other. What do we do with the data? As you can see on our slide, we have three main options for where data can live. It can live on the server, delivered via web service on the device, or both local and server. If you go with server-side data, remember that security is really important here. Apple now requires all server data to be sent via HTTPS, which you should have been doing anyway, but let's just call that out. And other platforms are doing the same. So this isn't just a best practice, it's becoming a requirement. Is your data old, historical? Is it like very old records that may not have been set up this way? Were they encrypted at all? Do you have to think about this? Because now that you're delivering data back and forth to an actual mobile app, now this is something that Apple and Google will have opinions about. Storing the data locally on the device may seem appealing. You might say, great, I can just miniaturize my .NET application and use SQLite, and I'm done. We should pause for a moment. Consider how much data you're dealing with, though. Local storage is not always the best solution. You have no idea how much space is actually on that phone. So just keep that in mind. The third option, which is syncing between local and server databases, is often the most flexible, but the most complex. Tools like Azure Mobile Services or Firebase and lots of other ones can make this easier, providing real-time database structures that are relatively lightweight. But the crucial question to ask here is syncing even necessary? Every sync operation uses the user's data. If your app is being used in areas with very limited internet access or expensive data plans, constant syncing can just be a really big drawback, and in fact might be the reason someone uninstalls your app. So this is how I define a truly necessary mobile app. Can it work offline? Should it work offline? Many banking apps, for example, cache your last known data for offline viewing. So that way you can load it up and then get in a plane, go on airplane mode, and then maybe just do a little bit of work on your finances for the week. In the end, your data strategy has to be driven by your app's specific needs and your user's conditions. So you have to consider offline functionality, data storage, the nature of your app when making the decision. And the right choice here can mean the difference between an app that's a joy to use and one that's constant frustration. So if you have chosen to not do, I'm going to assume everybody in their head has not chosen to do a mobile website, right? So because you've chosen not a mobile website, you have some offline functionality, right? What is of value about this app that can be done without the internet? Doesn't mean it never connects to the internet, but can it work without it? Should it work without it? Let's talk about where we should handle our business logic. So we have another three main options. You can go on the server, in the app code, or a third-party API call, or some other installed application. And this decision can be divisive in the industry. In a team I worked with previously, many of the devs insisted on handling all of the business logic in the mobile app, all of it. They wanted control over everything beyond just the basic data retrieval. So there are some cases where this makes sense, like that calculator app, right? That makes sense for the business logic to be in there. Or do you remember the solar eclipse from earlier in the year that ended up happening all over the world? There is an app that uses the phone's location and accelerometer to determine if you are in the totality zone all offline. It was pretty cool, right? That's a great example of when to keep the logic on the device, when it makes sense for it to be there with you. However, most of the time, it's not necessary. And it's inefficient to handle all of the business logic on the phone. That's where our other options come in. So putting the logic on the server makes sense for complex calculations when you have long-running processes, or if you need to maintain a consistency in that business logic across multiple platforms. Then there's the third option, using third-party APIs or installed applications to do some of that. This is a powerful approach that completely gets overlooked, is the other installed applications. If you know that when you're building your app, for whatever you're building, you don't need to build a whole camera interface and access the API, where you have to decide how long to hold, the shutter open for, etc. Just call the device's default camera app and retrieve the resulting image file. That's it. So you didn't have to build that part of your application. The same goes for sharing functionality. Use the device's built-in sharing options rather than reinventing the wheel. Just allow what's built into the phones and built into the ecosystem around it to do some of the lifting. Usually it's a smaller app footprint, it's faster, and that way it's customizable to the person. Nothing's worse than going to a government website that I shall not name and being told to download an app that will open up a camera that has me sideways and only has a capture button. I have no ability to change my lighting. I don't have any ability to change anything. But if I had used my default camera app, I could do all those things. And then I wouldn't have to worry about turning it sideways when I'm taking a picture of me before I'm entering a country. Right? The key is to be strategic. Just consider what truly needs to be handled in the app itself, what can be offloaded to a server, and where you can leverage that existing capability. Now let's tackle the crucial question in mobile app development. How do you want to create the UX? Figured out the answer? You got two main approaches. If you use a common UI, it sounds great in theory. Frameworks like Maui or React Native will allow you to write once, and it will render the native controls across. But maybe that's not the look and feel you want. Let's say this is what a button looks like in Android. This is what this looks like in iOS. But maybe you want just a different feel. You need just enough of the functionality to feel the same, but you still want to customize it, which is why I suggest maybe that you have a shared business logic across the platforms and then strip down a little bit of your UI itself separately. As the saying goes, you never know who's out there with a slingshot aimed at your app or something like that. At my previous company, we were fortunate enough to have an ethical hacker whose job it was to break into our apps and find vulnerabilities 40 hours a week. I would love that job, right? It sounds fun. But that's not the case for everyone. If you're working solo on mobile apps like I did for years, thinking about all the ways your data could be stolen or your app exploited can be overwhelming. And when we talk about weakness, it's not always about the catastrophic data breaches that you're used to, right? Sometimes it's just as simple as a cheat code in a game. That's it. Imagine you've created the next Angry Birds and somebody reverse engineers your app to get extra points. That's a vulnerability. Technically, they didn't hack you, but did they? I mean, the whole point of what you're doing is to get people to earn it, right? It's still a form. You may seem harmless, but it's still a form of it. The good news is you don't need to hire a full-time ethical hacker to test your app security. There are a lot of freelance ones on Fiverr that are great at this. You simply give them access and ask them to find vulnerabilities. Just make sure to handle the legal aspects properly to protect both parties. And this is a huge growing market. So if you ever decide that you're bored on a weekend and you want to look into just ethical hacking, it's a really fun side gig. So now you've got to discover where those weakest links are. Usually it's at the ground level. You know, the stuff you wrote in the beginning usually has your weakest links because it doesn't make sense that it would be that way because we spent all this time preparing for it. But it's because once you build it, you kind of leave it alone, right? Sometimes it can just erode depending on what you built on top of it or the time frame. You built this and then something has been cracked or changed out there and you haven't thought about going back in and putting like a new approach to that algorithm. You could incrementally test your code via different platform emulators. This is a good option and a great starting point. But the code you write first often deteriorates really fast in mobile development. So write tests that make sense for you, that can catch issues as you go. Don't wait till you built the whole thing. You have to test incrementally. We're better about that now, but what does TDD mean for mobile? I can tell you what that means. Are we talking about end-to-end tests or integration tests? You should have seen how many devices we physically had. We went out and bought so many of them. Same device, older age. We put a whole bunch of apps on one of them. We had a brand new, flashed build an other, like just all the different situations. We would go through and say, okay, what will happen if they lose signal? And we would put them in different offline modes. And now there are beta testers online that will do this for you remotely. You can actually just remote into the boxes that these are plugged into and just watch the process. Or you can let them look at it and then just report to you. Like, I don't need to watch the process, but they'll record every interaction that they do. It's pretty cool because it's just not possible for you to test everything. And unfortunately, with mobile apps, happy path is never enough. You must test multiple because I can have the same phone as my sister, but she has way more cat pictures on hers than I do on mine. So just the way we interact with our devices is different and may cause some strange thing to happen within our apps. You have to be more objective about what you're doing. Thorough testing is key to this successful mobile launch. And I know that we're getting very close to the end, so I want to show you this fun mobile architecture decision tree that I put together. It's just asking you 4 questions. Based on your answers to these questions, this flowchart kind of guides you to which of the development approaches you might take for the app that was in your head. Are you on this tight budget? Does it need constant internet connectivity to work at all? Will it have offline functionality? And will it need to access device features? This will kind of help guide. If you notice, there might still be a couple of different options, but it's better to kind of know which approach might work best. Whether you're working with a limited budget, need offline capabilities, require anything, this is a little bit helpful at least as a starting point. So I guess my parting advice really to you is just separate that must-have list from your nice-to-have list. The best approach is the one that you completely understand so you can unwind it if it doesn't work. And try to test often and catch things early so that you can really get to where you want to go. Build in time for mistakes. You'll learn more from them, and you can share those lessons with your team or even on your blog. I'm happy to share the biggest mistake I got to make in mobile app development when it came to understanding concurrent runtimes and what happens when you deal with cross-platform compiled approaches to native. Turns out they have different garbage collectors. Did you know that? All sorts of different things come out. The one thing I love about the mobile app space is that we're still kind of a little bit hardware in addition to the software. You get to play more with device features and understand how finite some of these things are. And the point of all of this is to really build thoughtfully and think ahead of time. This is the most waterfall approach I've ever done in tech is mobile because you have so much to do. The fire hose is so big. The best way to be successful is to sit down and start with what is your end result and work your way back. Thank you very much.